Okay guys, so video for Tuesday, April 28th, 2020. Three key concepts today, so let's see how quickly we can get through them. 5.3, industrialization begins, 5.4, industrialization spreads, and then 5.5, into technology in the industrial age. So the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the context or the background behind it is that with the Columbian Exchange, with the growth of maritime trading empires, you have increased agricultural productivity, and as well as the individual accumulation of capital leads to the Industrial Revolution. Individual accumulation of capital basically means that people individually are making money themselves. Capital is money. And so in these pre-industrial societies, most people lived in rural areas, so that's like out in the country. They grew most of their own food, they made most of their own clothes. And then you have something that kind of changes that a little bit with, obviously, the introduction of all those other things, but you have the introduction of these things called cottage industries. The cottage industry was created to compete with Indian cotton because it was a way for it to be cheaper. So Indian cotton was a natural or a raw, I guess you could say, material that was located in India. And because India at the time had now become a colony of Great Britain, they wanted to find a way to make it more accessible to the people of Great Britain. So they basically took the raw material from India and then shipped it over. These merchants would then give the raw cotton to women who would spin it at home. So that's where the nickname, the cottage industry, comes from, because it's located in the home. So you can see the picture there of the women with, I want to say it's a loom, used to spin or weave the different thread. It did allow women to gain a certain level of independence. The pay was very, very low, and the production was slow, and it was very, very intense labor, because a lot of it was just done by themselves or whoever was in the home, and then they still had to manage the duties and the responsibilities of being a wife and a mother as well. But it did give them a certain level of independence because they were able to make their own income. The investor demand for faster production is actually what's going to grow and cause a need for the growth of factories. So we are also going to see agricultural improvement. You're going to see some developments in crop rotation. You're also going to see the creation of the seed drill, which is going to make it easier to plant things. And so all of these improvements are going to lead to an increase as well as population, because if people are eating better, the population is going to rise. And so there's also going to be a need for less farmers, because now you have machines to do a lot of the production for you. And so farming is not going to be a major job market area. People are going to need to look for jobs. And a lot of small farms are going to go out of business. And I'll explain that more in depth in a little bit. So you're going to have a need for people to move more away from the country areas and move towards the cities, because they're looking for jobs in these factories. Some new technology that was created during this time, you have a lot of them. You have the spinning jenny. It was created by James Hargreaves. It's a machine that helps you spin more than one thread at a time. So it's like a big giant loom that allows multiple threads or multiple fabrics, I guess, to be put together all at once. And so the production of producing textiles, cotton, clothing becomes a lot faster. You also have the invention of the water frame, which was invented by Richard Arkwright, who becomes known as the father of the factory, because Arkwright pretty much invented the water-powered spinning wheel. What it did was that it actually doomed the cottage industry, because the spinning wheel was too big to have in the home. You needed a big open area or a big open space, and so these factories had to be built, and people needed to work in these factories. So again, it dooms the cottage industry. Then you have the creation of interchangeable parts by Eli Whitney. You guys might know him as the father of the cotton gin. If a part broke, it could be easily replaced. As opposed to replacing or fixing the entire machine, interchangeable parts allows you to kind of go in there and just fix whatever is broken or whatever is not working at the time. And so the whole machine is not useless anymore. It's just that little part that needs to be fixed. Division of labor has to do with when you have managers and you have workers, not everybody has to be skilled, especially in a factory, because you were trained kind of just to do one certain job, and that was the only job that you had, which leads to the next definition, which is specialization of labor. Each person has a specific job. This doesn't necessarily mean that you are skilled in this job. It just means that this is your specific job, especially in terms of when it comes to the assembly line. So kind of like they all feed off of one another. There's a picture there of the assembly line, which was created essentially by Henry Ford. Ford Motor Vehicles. It's a moving line that was made for quick production in factories. So one person would have a role, and their job was to put one specific piece over and over into different parts repeatedly, and so the person didn't move, the parts moved. And so you're kind of looking at like a conveyor belt type of thing, and your specific job, your specific task is to do the same thing all day. Yeah, so it's intense. Then you have the creation of the steam engine, which is probably going to be one of the most revolutionary things during this time. There's a lot of questions as to where the steam engine actually comes from. There's no real one inventor of the steam engine. There's actually supposed to be three British gentlemen that are credited with creating the steam engine. So the very first crude steam engine was built by Thomas Savery in England in 1698. Then the next stage of history recognizes Thomas Newcomen, also of England. Newcomen realized that there has to be a way of improving upon the first version of the steam-powered pump, because the first version was just basically a way to help or alleviate some of the work. Newcomen built a machine where the steam engine actually pushed a movable piston in one direction. So this is more of a true steam engine, and it was originally used to pump water out of coal mines. That's going to be really, really important, because in the Industrial Revolution, coal is going to be one very, very valuable resource to a lot of countries. Then in 1765, James Watt greatly improved upon the other two gentlemen's discoveries or technologies by adding a separate condenser to avoid heating and cooling the cylinder with each stroke, because if it becomes too hot or overheated, it's going to jam, it's not going to work. So Watt then developed this new engine, which has a rotating shaft instead of providing the simple up and down motion of the pump, and he added other improvements as well. So if you were to Google this or look it up, who invented the steam engine, James Watt's probably the one that's going to be most recognized, because his is the most modern version of it, but the other two gentlemen should receive some of the credit because it was their ideas that kind of helped drive the transition or the growth of the steam engine process. So, in terms of Industrial Revolution and advantages, Great Britain greatly had the advantage above everybody else. They had 6 things that pretty much nobody else had at the time. So in terms of the first Industrial Revolution, Great Britain is going to kill it. Number 1, they are located near waterways. That is super important because it helps with transportation. It helps with the importation of goods, so bringing goods into the country. And obviously, of course, they had the steam power, or they had the capability of steam power. 2, lots of natural mineral resources, especially coal. Coal is extremely important because coal helps power the steam engine. So it helps produce and create all of these machines that are necessary for industrialization. 3, they also had access to resources in the colonies. They had colonized lots of territories in the New World as well as other places, so they had easy access to timber to build more ships, and then they had easy access to lots of capital, which is money, which makes them very, very powerful. Number 4, they had the strongest navy. Out of everybody in the world at the time, they probably had the most ships, again, because of the resources that they had. They are a water-based country, or a maritime empire, if you will. And they had the resources, like I said, to build these ships, and the money and the timber. Number 5, their laws. So they went through a lot of issues regarding their monarchy, regarding their parliament, regarding their government, and part of their laws, or their new set of laws, is that private property is protected in Great Britain, so the government could not go and seize private property. So this made business owners really, really happy, because the government couldn't just show up and go and seize their ships and take them and hold them against their will. They needed to have some proof of criminal activity, and if you were just a regular businessman, that was not going to be you. And so the fact that your rights were protected made you want to invest your business in this process. So it was very, very helpful for them. Lastly, you had a lot of increased population in urban areas. With farms and small farms going out of business and farming not becoming a major job, how do you call it? Like it's not a specialized type of labor anymore, because the machines are doing a lot of the work. And so people are needing work to be able to feed their families. You're going to have people moving from these rural areas to urban cities, especially because of the Enclosure Act. So the Enclosure Act, it's spelled a little bit differently there. So if you look it up, it might be spelled with an I, and there's a reason for that. The original Enclosure Act, what it did is that you would have big fields and big open areas in Great Britain, and most of this land was considered common ground or common area. So if you were a farmer, you could go and plant a crop, or you could go try to produce or provide for your family in a certain area because the land was considered communal. The Enclosure Act did away with that. The Enclosure Act privatized these pieces of land, and it either gave them to people who bought the land or it gave them to the government. And so these farmers, again, are going to lose a lot of their original small farms, and they're going to go out of business. So they're going to have to find a way to move to the city to be able to find other jobs in factories and provide for their families. All right, so the spread of industrialization, some quick context. Great Britain industrialized, spreading cheap cotton around the world and replacing the Indian textile production. I did kind of already mention that. So basically, they stole all of India's raw cotton. They took it back to Great Britain. They would manufacture it over there, and then they would sell it back to the Indian people at an extremely higher price. So it's going to make them go out of business. Other countries like Belgium, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan are going to follow in industrialization. They're on the next slide, so I'll explain them in a minute. Each nation also shared things in common, which made them industrial powers. Things like capital, money, natural resources, coal, iron, and steel, which we'll see, and also water transportation, easy access to the oceans. So in France, industrialization was actually kind of slow. A lot of that had to do with the problems in the government because of the French Revolution. So they're going through their own kind of turmoil with instability in the government. They also have a really small population, and there's not a lot of people to work in the factories. So industrialization is slow to take off in France. In Germany, it was also slow. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that Germany was not a unified country, which we talked about yesterday. Once Germany does become unified, it is going to become a major producer of steel and coal. So it's 1871 under Otto von Bismarck that they become a unified country, that they are able to now become kind of a superpower as part of the industrialized groupings of other countries as well. The United States is going to see a big jumpstart, probably more towards the second industrial revolution, which we'll get to as well. They're industrialized by the 19th century, which technically is the 1800s. Remember, we're about 100 years in reverse. So by 1900, they were the leading industrial power. And the reason for that is because in the US, we had huge amounts of human capital, which is our workforce. We had lots and lots of people to work. You had immigrants that were coming by the masses from Europe. You also had people that were migrating from the country to the cities, again, because that's where the jobs were. In Russia, it's state-sponsored industrialization. That means that the state, the government, the monarchy, because at that point they're still a monarchy, the czar or the emperor, the king, is still in charge of this process. So in Russia, they are going to heavily focus on the railroads. They're going to create what's known as the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So I put a picture of it there. Essentially what it does is that it connects Moscow to the Pacific Ocean. So it's going to make trade extremely easy with a lot of Asian countries, including East Asia, China, and Japan. They are going to become leaders in terms of coal, iron, and steel, which is really ironic because they're going to become very well known for these three things, but their country is still going to remain largely agricultural until 1907. Remember, they had a very large population that was still tied to serfdom and still tied to like the ancient feudal system in that area. Japan is an interesting country because of all the countries we've talked about, they're either European or they're colonized by Europeans. Japan is the only Asian country that's going to modernize or industrialize first. And they considered it a defensive modernization. Japan knew that if they did not industrialize, if they did not keep up with the other countries, it was going to be very easy for those bigger superpowers, if you will, to come and invade them. And so their motivation for industrialization was out of a need for protection. They began to use technology from Europe and the United States to try and help actually protect their traditional values. However, they still adopted things like European dress and European weapons to kind of incorporate them into society. But the majority of their reason for modernization, for industrialization, was to build up their military, to build up their economy, to be able to protect themselves and defend themselves from these other powers that are going to come in to be major players in this game. So as far as also industrialization spreading, I'll move myself right now when I talked about the bottom. You have shipbuilding in India and Southeast Asia. Great Britain had colonized this region in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Historically, shipbuilding had been prominent in the region. However, mismanagement of resources and poor leadership by Great Britain made the industry suffer. So corruption within the country is going to cause India to lose a lot of its once prominent power in this specific area. Ironworks in India is also going to be an area, or a region where they're hit kind of hard, especially because Great Britain also controlled India's mineral production. The company control, or the fact that the British East India Company, and that's their insignia, their logo right there, controlled India, is going to make it very difficult for the native people to work and mine these minerals. Because one, they had very, very high taxes. That's one. A lot of mines had to be closed because of this reason. People couldn't pay the taxes. But two, Great Britain was very hesitant to allow the Indian people to continue to mine for resources because they were fearful that the people from India were going to rise up against them. So they actually created the Arms Act of 1878, which limits Indian access to these minerals and to these firearms out of fear of them rebelling or uprising. And so at one point, these mines are inactive for such a long time that people even forget they're even there. The very last thing, I'm going to move myself, there we go, is the textile production in India and in Egypt. Textiles, I told you guys to remember, how do y'all text? You text with your hands. So what are textiles? Textiles are anything you can make with your hands. British textiles were competing with Indian textile mills because they wanted them to be cheaper. And they basically stole the market. They stole the economy from the Indian people. So at the very, very top, I have like rugs. All of these would have been, hand done by people who were very specialized. It would be a trade. It'd be something that was passed down from generation to generation, and therefore the rugs in India are going to be much more expensive than they would be in Great Britain, because in Great Britain it's a machine that is pumping out these things rapidly, and obviously the quality is probably a lot not as great, but it's a lot cheaper, and so people are going to want to buy the cheaper product than the more expensive product. So it's going to put the Indian people and the Indian production of some of these textiles, as well as Egyptian textiles, out of business. Move myself here. All right, so technology in the industrial age. We're almost done. During the first industrial revolution, it does lead to an increased access to resources and the increased distribution of goods to those resources that they helped create. The first industrial revolution, you're going to see stuff like the steam engine, in the internal combustion engine, railroad, ships, and factories. In the second industrial revolution, it's going to be a lot more. It's going to shift. So you're going to see the use of chemicals, you're going to see the use of steel, you're going to see precision machinery, you're going to see electronics, communication, especially when in terms of devices like the phone and the radio. So I have a picture of the railroad up there, and I have a picture of kids actually working in a factory. And the reason for that is because child labor is going to become a huge issue during this time. Many, many children are going to have to leave the home to go help support their families as well. And every single member in the household is going to have to work too. Okay, so the coal revolution. The switch to coal power symbolized a shift from most things being powered by man or by animal. So most things being powered by fossil fuels, coal being one of them, oil being another, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The steam engine, which was invented or changed by James Watt in 1765, was able to harness the power of coal to create steam, which generates energy for these machines, for these factories. So you have a picture of James Watt, you have a picture of, I want to say the Titanic, I don't want to be mistaken, but most often it's a steamship. You have those big giant things at the top, I don't know what they're called, but they have to emit, or they have to release all of that steam, because you can't have it built up or it's going to overheat and bad things will happen. So within 50 years, steam was powering these huge, large, giant ships. With steam power, factories no longer had to be near water, because now they could rely on coal. It also helped Great Britain industrialize the railroad, because these railroads could now run on coal. Water transportation. Steamships changed sailing, because you did not have to worry anymore about wind or currents or anything like that. You could turn the ship on, you could turn the ship off, you could go upstream, you could go downstream, you could go against the wind, you could go with the wind. It replaced these very large sailing ships, and you had coaling stations that were popping up all over the place also for people to stop, dock, and refuel these ships. Iron is going to allow for coal allowed iron to be manufactured, because there's a process in which you mix the two to be able to create a stronger metal. Iron is going to be a huge improvement in the manufacturing process. So the picture there is actually children that worked in a coal mine. Coal mining was extremely difficult, back-breaking labor. You're underground for hours at a time. You're breathing in coal dust. Many of these people, and including children, died from lung issues and complications, respiratory problems, and you're just in complete darkness. And so it was very, very, very sad and tragic time. You're going to have a lot of these things that are happening at this time that are eventually going to cause or create the need for child labor laws. So more context about the Second Industrial Revolution. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the development in steel, chemicals, as well as precision machinery and electronics is going to greatly influence this second wave of industrialization. So one is the steel production. You have this new process known as the Bessemer process, which allows for iron and carbon to be combined to make steel. Steel is going to become the backbone of industrial society. It's stronger. It's going to be easier to manufacture and produce worldwide. So people are going to become extremely wealthy off of steel. You also have oil, which is a new resource for energy. Oil is a fossil fuel, meaning it is derived from animal remains. It is also I'm trying to think of the word, non-renewable resource. So once we're run out of it, that's it. There's no more. The results are going to be that we're going to have kerosene to power our light lamps, the internal combustion engine, as well as the automobile, as well as the airplane. Electricity is going to be created in about 1882 with the very first public power station beginning to generate electricity, and then communication is going to take off as well. Alexander Graham Bell is going to be credited with creating the telephone, as well as Guglielmo Marconi with the radio. All right, and global trade and migration. Last slide. So railroads, steamships, and the telegraph are going to make exploration, development, and communication possible. It's going to create immediate communication, which is going to completely change the world. When you had to wait a month, for a letter, or you had to wait weeks for messenger service or something like that, the telegraph, the telephone, the radio is going to create instant communication. It's going to change things. The Transcontinental Railroad is actually going to make connecting people also a lot easier. It connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So basically it goes all the way from California to the east, or from the west coast to the east coast. It does create a need and a growth for industrialization. It's going to allow the resources of the United States to be connected with each other. And so this is what's going to make the United States a huge, giant powerhouse. Railroads are also going to help, in general, people move from these rural country areas to urban city areas a lot easier. So you need people to build these railroads, people to work on these railroads, and so again, it's also going to create a huge job market as well. For the first time, farmers, manufacturers, miners, customers, whether it was domestically, which means at home, or internationally, were connected with each other. And then countries like Great Britain, France, and the US are going to continue to industrialize. They're going to have to continue to find ways to protect their natural resources, to make sure that they don't run out of these things, because that's what makes them these powerhouses in the world. And they're also going to need to look for further natural resources. So it's going to be a cause for eventually more imperialistic motivations and the need for establishing colonies in other places, especially in Asia and Africa, because they're going to want to go and take and steal resources that they have, that they need to further industrialize. All right, so your exit ticket, I want to reiterate that how important this is. It is extremely, extremely, extremely important that you complete the AP Survey link as soon as possible. That's your assignment. Your other pressing matter is that this week's DBQ is going to be different. We are trying to simulate the actual AP exam, so it's going to be on a Thursday, which is when the actual AP exam is, on a Thursday at 1 p.m. this time, not at 11 a.m. You guys are used to signing in at 11 a.m. because that's when this class is supposed to be held, but it's going to be at 1 p.m. because the day of your actual AP exam, it's Thursday, May 13th at 1 p.m. So for the next 2-3 weeks, we're going to be doing it on a Thursday at 1 p.m. to get you in the habit, because you need to wake up at least 30 minutes before. You need to log in. You need to make sure you have access to your College Board accounts, to your College Board's email, your College Board password, because the AP College Board is going to send you your exams via email, and that's how you're going to upload and log in and do all of those other things. So make sure you do those things. And if you have any questions, call me, email me, shoot me a private message on Google Classroom. Anything else? That's pretty much it. See you guys later. Bye-bye.